Hello, this is Signals from the Hill, a podcast about comics from Avery Hill Publishing. I'm Ricky Miller, co-publisher at Avery Hill. In this episode, we have a conversation with Lucy Sullivan as we celebrate the release of a new edition of her book, Barking. Lucy is an artist and writer based in London. Alongside her creative work, Lucy lectures in illustration and animation at university level and mentors aspiring comic creators and graphic novelists. Her debut graphic novel, Barking, based on her own experience of a mental health crisis, has garnered awards, praise from critics, and is on the required reading list for UCLA's Art and Trauma Collegiate program. I discussed with Lucy the arts and media that have influenced her and fed into her work, from horror movies to classic TV series and PJ Harvey. Here it is. Hi, Lucy. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Very
Good.
well.
Where are you at the moment?
Southeast London, New Cross Gate, so
Okay.
Lewisham Way. Yeah, it's dark, it's moody, it's been raining, it's London.
It's an area I know very well, and the weather I
Mm.
know very well. How long have you lived in Southeast London?
We've been here, we moved in 2012, so my maths is on is falling. 11
12 years.
years, 12
Yeah,
years,
yeah.
12 years. Yeah, so, and we're going to leave this year. So it's a bit of a like,
Oh, okay.
and we sort of said if we hit getting bored or didn't like this part of London that we were probably done with London. So we're done with London. We've had enough.
Wow.
I know, and I'm a Londoner, so it's a bit of a bummer. But yeah, we're
Yeah,
going to Brighton. It's London on Sea,
I'm
I
trying to think,
think.
but well, yeah, I mean that's a good option. It is a good. It is
Yeah,
basically London on Sea. Yeah. Yeah, I'm trying to think. Maybe you're the closest geographically to the actual Avery Hill
yeah.
of our artists. I think you might be now.
Me and Cat, is Cat nearby? Maybe
No,
no.
Cat's a bit further out, so she's a bit further south. So yeah, no, I think yeah, I mean you're only like a few miles from actual Avery Hill, I think. So wow,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
uh,
It was meant
um,
to be.
yeah, absolutely. So you grew up in London. What part of
I
London?
did. All over because my parents ran pubs. So originally Fulham, we were had a pub on the Fulham Broadway, the Golden Lion, which was an amazing pub. I absolutely loved it. It was an Edwardian pub. We had a big main bar and then a small kind of ladies bar, the wine bar. And it was a live music pub, so we used to have like
Oh
bands
wow.
on in the main pub. Yeah, it was amazing. So I
Did
was
you have
always
anyone that went on to bigger things?
yeah, so Fulham is really near Hammersmith, where all the big record companies were in the like 70s and 80s. So we had all the like A&R people and loads of road like most of our bar staff doubled as roadies, so they'd often go off on tours. My dad used to work within the music industry scene a lot as well. And yeah, we had um Pink Floyd in, we had the Clash played.
Wow.
We had Dire Straits
Oh my
played.
God.
Oh no, Dire Straits didn't play
Oh.
because my dad refused to pay them. They wanted £5 each, and he told Mark Knopfler he was a knobhead and he couldn't have
I mean, Mark Knopfler
it.
probably is a knobhead, so
He is a knobhead. Yeah. I saw today he's a member of the Garrick Club. There's this whole thing about, this posh men only club. And I thought, God, my dad would be so annoyed if he knew that Knopfler had got into the Garrick Club. I could hear him going, "Why? The man's a knobhead, £5 each." So yeah, they didn't get paid much in those days, but that was
No.
like a couple of years before Money for Nothing came out, and they
Wow,
hit
yeah.
the big time, and yeah. So anyway, sore point in our house. We also had Chaz and Dave play, which I think is pretty epic,
Yeah, yeah,
personally.
that's probably the best of all those,
Yeah,
definitely.
yeah,
Wow.
for sure. Who needs Dire Straits when you've got Chaz and Dave?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so we're here because you've released your first graphic novel again through us.
Yeah.
Um, and can you tell us a bit about what it's about and why you made it?
So barking is an allegory based on my experience of having a breakdown in my 20s, where my dad died quite suddenly. And I found myself a couple of years later in a really bad place, and I ended up getting diagnosed with depression and anxiety. And then I got sort of 20 years down the line, maybe a bit less. No, it's probably about 15 years down the line. Yeah, I was starting to get depressed again. I'd had my daughter. I was sort of struggling with, oh no, it was before I had my daughter. I was struggling with finding any satisfaction with the work I was doing. I was an animator. I did hand-drawn animation. I was working for these animation studios, just like drawing backgrounds and being really well paid for it, and creatively just totally unfulfilled. I was also teaching life drawing, and one of my students was Nick Abadzis, who did Leica. And we were talking about comics all the time, and I was just sort of like, what if I wanted to make a comic, how would I do it? And he's like, start with something you think you can talk about and just make it, sort of thing. And it was like, well, I can definitely talk about some experiences. And then my partner just said, well, what if you talk about what you're going through now, or what it's about, and maybe that might help you deal with it a bit. And I just started, coming up with a story around the sort of idea of the black dog, because I really kind of drawn to that as a symbolism. And then my partner Steve's from Yorkshire, where obviously black shuck's from. And then I started looking into the kind of mythology around black dogs and this portent of doom. And then that sort of links so much to like the sudden death I dealt with. And so it just sort of grew from that. But originally it was just going to be about my experience. And then I had a couple of friends who were sectioned, and seeing what they went through, I thought it's a bigger story. It's not actually just about me. It's about how we socially kind of deal with people who are struggling and vulnerable. And I wasn't sectioned. I got private help for what I was going through, but I think had I been, it would have been worse for me. So I just wanted to talk about what I'd seen them go through and what I'd been through. And essentially it's a story, the character in it sort of goes through things that she feels everything I felt at the time, but I've put her in this position of where my friends were, and I guess put me in the past through being sectioned and what that would have encompassed, and tried to talk about grief triggered depressions and breakdowns, and the mental health system in general. But it's also a bit of a ghost story as well, and it's got a lot of influences from some of the things we're going to talk about today, actually.
Sure, yeah, which is an excellent link into the next bit. So obviously, there's a lot of heavy autobiographical stuff going on in there, which you've spoken about quite a few times before with various people. So what I thought was we could talk about some of the other things that go into your work, some other cultural influences. And to do this, I asked you for a film, a song, a book, a comic, and a TV show. And not necessarily your favorites, but ones where they've kind of welded their way into how you think and what you do and how you create. And the idea is that we talk about them and look at how they influence your work and maybe what they say about your work a little bit as well.
Yeah.
Like I found in the past, as I kind of go through these with other creators, they kind of start thinking a lot more about, oh, okay, that I forgot about that. That element is in my work as well. Like with especially with like George Wilder's soul, we definitely found the more he thought about The Shining, for example, the more he thought, oh, that came from there. That was deep in my subconscious.
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? I
Yeah,
love this as a way to kind of explore your stories, and what you just don't realize what's got in there. And it's always quite surprising when you
yeah,
go, oh God, that really affects how I think about things. And a lot of the ones I spoke about, they sort of had a creatively kind of really profound effect on me, but they also completely changed the way I view the world in some ways. And that's the best thing, I think, when something kind of really gets to you and it sort of changes your lookout entirely. I think that's a really amazing thing.
yeah. That's the great power of art, isn't it?
Mm.
Firstly, do you like watch TV or listen to music while you're working?
Uh, TV, not so much. I do sometimes, like I did this week, and I love watching like Glastonbury when it's on. I like having that on the iPlayer when I work, but it depends entirely what the work is. So if I'm writing, no, I have to just have music that has no lyrics whatsoever. I need quite specific music because I find it quite hard to just. I do find writing one of the harder ones because I can't. I don't know. I find it hard to just sit at a screen and just sort of type or write down. I'm mainly at a computer, and I find that quite challenging. Whereas drawing, I'm quite physical, so it's a distraction in of itself, kind of thing. Whereas just sitting at a screen, I find quite a lot. So yeah, I have to have music that really helps me focus. So I have a lot kind of like electronica and like really sort of soundscapey stuff, lots of kind of Olaf Olsen and people like that. That's Niels Fram, just
Nothing intrusive.
nothing intrusive. Yeah, I like a lot of kind of soundtrack stuff. It's quite helpful for that, but it depends if it then takes over. But if I'm drawing, I like something that I can just sing along to really loudly and badly. So I feel sorry for my neighbours when I'm drawing. Yeah, so that's my drawing desk, and I will have I've got music on really, really loud. I'm singing really, really loud. I'm usually here on my own at that point, so it's just the dog looking at me like, God, shut up.
I'm assuming it's not like Kylie. This is like heavy stuff you're singing.
No, I mean light stuff. I have like a huge playlist that's like an album mix, and I just chuck that on. So it's all sorts of stuff, just random music. But I like a lot of kind of guitar music. I was a 90s teenager.
Yeah.
So yeah, a lot of kind of guitar music like Radiohead and stuff like that. But I really like things like at the moment really into Salt. I really like them. I went through a huge hip hop phase when I was younger and a bit of a kind of like soul music phase. So I quite like a bit of Northern soul and stuff to kind of shout and sing to, kind of bop in my chair to. But yeah, anything really. I'm not too fussy. I still like a bit of hip hop every now and again, but not as much as I did. It was like old school hip hop I liked, like 80s stuff, Eric B and Rakim and stuff.
Oh,
so
nice.
Like,
Paid
really,
in full.
Yeah, like really old stuff and De La Soul and things when it was all like the worst thing you could do was slag off someone's mum and then you could have a dance off about it.
Yeah, slag off their cooking and stuff.
Yeah, your mum is so fat because her biscuits are amazing. But it's all very calm. But yeah, I'm weird finding that I'm increasingly really specific about what I have to listen to or do depending on the work and what I'm doing. So I was like I'm doing a talk tomorrow for a uni and I was putting a presentation together so I could have like TV on the side and do that. Or I love an audio book actually. If I'm doing something like Photoshop or something, and sometimes drawing, I really get into an audio book that can be really fantastic.
Cool. As we've just been talking a lot about music, I think we should probably do the song first then. So would you like to say what the song is?
So I went for Sheila and the Gig, or Sheila and the Gee, depending on how you pronounce it. But I always said Sheila and the Gig, but she sings it the Gee. By Holly Jane Harvey, PJ Harvey, who she's just extraordinary person and an amazing musician, and this kind of like powerhouse that just has always done her own thing and changed it. And I think she's got that thing that Kate Bush has, where she's just trailblazing and doing her thing. And I have to say, when I was about 17 or something, so my godfather was a production manager for like gigs. So he did all these massive gigs and he'd go and set up all the lighting and the sound. He was a sound engineer originally. And he never knew what to get me for presents. He was like so confused. He didn't have kids. He didn't know how to deal with girls, and he'd just find me things and be like, "Oh, I don't know, maybe you'll like this." And one year he got me a load of CDs, and in there was like The Breeders and PJ Harvey's Rid of Me and a couple of other things. And I listened to Rid of Me, and at first I just didn't get it. It was just so intense and melancholic and full on, and it was like I wanted to like it, but I didn't know. And the album cover was really disturbing. She's like super, super skinny, the sort of heroin chic era of the 90s. And I think she's just in water or something. She looks like she's drowning. I found it really intense. So it was a real slow burn for me with PJ Harvey's stuff, but not Sheila McGee. It's just this like ode to kind of women of the ages. And so if you don't know, Sheila McGee is like an Irish sort of what do you call them, like a gargoyle that you get
Hmm.
all around Ireland. And even though it's quite sort of pagan, it's on churches, it's on everywhere, just on the sides of roads, sides of buildings. And it's this kind of squat little figure that is quite unpleasant characteristics, but she's a fertility symbol. So she's sort of got this really elaborate kind of vagina that she's pulling apart, and she's sort of like wanton and like calling men to make her pregnant. So she's this god of fertility and stuff. So she's sort of taken this idea of this wanton woman and sings it from that perspective. Um, but she's got a bastard guy, and she's like, he's just treating her like hell. He talks about her take your dirty pillows away from me, like talking about her breasts like they're just disgusting. And so she's being used and abused basically, and she's singing at him like, look at me though, look at my childbearing hips and my ruby red lips. And he's just like, you're disgusting, I'm gonna wash it, and then she's like, I'm gonna wash that man out of my hair. And it's just, I don't know, there's something about it. It's just like women can be, rubbish and ugly and filthy and tarts and slappers, and but also we can be empowered by that. And it's a sort of form of storytelling I'd never heard before in that way. And I think in the way that maybe like maybe like Hole were doing, or Bikini Kill, but done with folk music. There's a more this sort of folky aspect to her music, and I found it astonishing, and I still listen to it regularly. It's on like one of my favorite song playlists, and it was a huge inspiration when I was doing my next stuff after Barking for Shelter, because that's all about kind of Irish diaspora, and I think it really speaks to something about that, about these sort of like old traditions but in modern thinking. And I think that's very much where her music is based. It's sort of got these like deep traditional roots, but she always brings this kind of modern new way of looking at it and new storytelling to it. It's fascinating.
Absolutely, yeah. Um, and now let's do the film now.
Yeah. So I chose American Werewolf in London. So, God, it's one of those films that is just so embedded in my psyche, and it's actually everything I think about death is related to this film in a really weird way. So I saw it because I grew up in a pub. We had like live-in bartenders, which means I had access to like illicit materials from a very young age. So all the adults would be downstairs. We'd often have like loads of kids up in the flat above the pub. So their parents would be drinking or whatever. And we'd just go into the barman's bedrooms and we'd take their VHSs and put them on and see what was on there, which could be quite, surprising at times. These were men in their 20s living away from home. But there are a lot of horror films, and we found someone had a tape of American Werewolf in London. So it was like I don't know, like a Sunday or Saturday afternoon or something, and everyone was downstairs. It was daylight, and we just shut the curtains and put it on. And my word, what a film! And I think it's
How old were you at that time?
so we left that pub when I was 6 or 7, so I must have been about 5
Wow,
when
yeah,
I saw
okay.
it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
I was like,
formative. Yeah.
it was a lot, and there were my sisters like 3 years older than me, and there would have been older kids yet that would have been watching it. So I've always had nightmares, so I would have been hiding for a lot of it. I remember when the transformation happened, I was just like, not watching this. So if you haven't seen it, two American tourists going on the Yorkshire moors. It gets dark. They go into a pub, the Slaughtered Lamb, which is the most iconic scene, I think, and still what it can feel like to go into a pub in Yorkshire sometimes. As someone who's with a Yorkshireman and
And
has an
South
English
London, to
accent,
be fair.
and South London, yeah, the wilds of Lewisham. They sort of walk in and then someone's doing darts and they literally do that stuff and it's like, and everyone stares at them like, what the hell are you doing here? And they just won't help them, and they just say, stay on the path, lads, don't go off the path. So obviously they go off the path, they get one of them gets killed by a werewolf, the other one gets bitten. He ends up back in London and has all these like crazy experiences as the kind of werewolf is developing in him. One of those experiences is seeing his dead friend in the mirror, right? And talking to his friend who's sort of like bitten and rotting and stuff. So when I saw this, my best friend had just died and he'd had childhood leukemia. So he had like I had to go and see him in the hospital and he had the whole tracheotomy thing and I mean it was really horrific and I was too young to really comprehend it, but I understood that he was really, really unwell and they'd done like a failed transplant and it was just the whole thing was horrible. And what I really understood was I just really, really missed him. So I found that scene really peaceful and I found it really amazing that someone could talk to someone they missed. And I found this like bizarre kind of comfort in it. And I still kind of do. I still see that scene, and it's just like, oh, it's so amazing. He got that chance to like talk to his friend, and weirdly, when my dad died, I had these dreams about him where we'd be like walking through a shop or something, and it would be like in the film, he'd be kind of rotting, and it's like, and I would be calm with it, and it's just amazing how it's got into my psyche of like, oh yeah, when people die you talk to them after they're dead and it's fine, and it's so bizarre. So I've sort of watched it on and off throughout my life. We saw a screening of it at the BFI with the director, and I've forgotten his name.
John
John
Landis.
Landis, yeah, who'd had an amazing tie on. Sort of talked us through. And, I think because it's all my partner's puppeteer, well, I did puppet animation and built puppets, and because it's all in camera and the transformation is all done with special makeup and prosthetics and stuff, it still looks pretty amazing and it's still a really extraordinary film. But it was a huge influence on Barking. So that's why in my book, her dead friend, Alex, whose dead friend has died and she's having this breakdown and gets sectioned, her friend reappears and is often on the ceiling or in a shadow. And it's because of American Werewolf, this idea that, you can manifest the person you're missing through this kind of grief and guilt. I think it's just embedded in my outlook on grief, and it's a really random thing, but it's something that I don't find, despite how it's meant to be a horror film, I find it weirdly comforting, and I don't feel like that with most horror films. I'll have months of nightmares after watching a horror film. Like I saw the last one I saw, I think was Midsummer, and I couldn't sleep for absolutely months. I kept waking up in the middle of the night replaying that scene that everyone knows what that is if they've seen it. I got through like 20 minutes of the Babadook and just went, no, can't watch this, and still had nightmares for months, even though I'd only seen 20 minutes of it. So it's not like I can deal with horror very well. I really, really struggle with it. I found out it's called something like, is it called hyperphantasia or something, where you can't separate fiction and reality. And that's my problem. If I see something, it immediately enters my canon as that's a thing that exists and happens in the world. It's not just a movie, it's an event that I've witnessed somehow. So yeah, I have to be really careful, but I can watch American Werewolf in London and not have bad dreams, weirdly. It's an odd thing.
And yeah, I mean, Barking has some horror elements in it. So to have a dead character appear would very easily be used as a horror trope. but yeah, you definitely don't do that. It is more of a peaceful thing. Yeah,
It's like a resolution thing, which is what he is doing in the film. He's trying to say to his friend, "I'm so sorry that you died and this happened to you, and and I think I'm in trouble," kind of thing. It's like it's a fallout to find the only person in the world he thinks is going to understand what he's going through, and I think that just made a lot of sense to me.
Let's do the book now.
Yeah. So I have to admit with this that I mostly listened to it as an audio book, but I think that still counts as a book.
It's okay. Yeah.
Yeah, because I have read it as a book.
Who reads the audiobook? Is it Ian Banks? Or?
It's really no, it's by an actor called Peter Kenny. So I've listened to it on Audible, but he's brilliant at voices, and it's a multi-character arc. So there's like a kind of wheeler dealer trader, Adrian, who's all like that in it. Like he's from Blackheath and he talks like that, and he does all of that. And then there's like a heavily Scottish accented assassin, and then there's one that's quite posh, and then there's these two women who have quite extraordinary accents. I mean, and there's one character who has just lost her mind. She's in this state of utter insanity, and he does that voice as well. And to be honest, I think it gave me clues about the story that I didn't get from reading it in a book, because you realize when you hear the audiobook, it's a multi-character, multi-dimensional story.
Yeah, we should say this is a transition by Ian
Banks,
because I
yeah.
interrupted you just as you were about to, so that was my
apologies. Yeah, it's a transition. So it's where Ian Banks does sort of sci-fi kind of space operas, and then he does these kind of like Scottish, normal, everyday kind of crime stuff. It's the one that sort of brings the two ways he writes together the most. I think it's sort of like a combination. Like if you ever like the kind of the Crow Road, but also you like consider Fleabag or whatever, it's sort of somehow brings the two together.
Yeah, and I'm a 90s teenager as well, so I read The Crow Road because I watched the TV adaptation.
Right, and I think everyone read The Crow Road. It's like sort of you weren't in the 90s if you didn't read The Crow Road almost. But I did read a few of his books, and it was only later that I got into the sort of sci-fi stuff, which is that Ian M. Banks he goes under or something.
Yeah. What's it's a whole linking thing, isn't there? Where there's about 8 of them. I can't remember what it's called.
Yeah, it's huge, and they are kind of amazing. But there was the last one I listened to had the most horrific gang rape scene in it, and I just sort of went, "Yeah, I think that's me done. I can't do that." So I'd stepped away from that. But this one, so transition starts with a traveller who wakes to find himself in a hospital, can't remember his name, but he remembers that he used to travel through different dimensions of the earth. And for some reason, he can't do it now. And then it swaps, like each chapter, it goes through these different characters. So one is this traveller assassin called Temujin, who is given jobs to go and kill people. He takes this little pill called Septus, and he sort of sneezes, and then he'll find himself in these other dimensions where these people are, and he kills them in a variety of ways in other people's bodies, whilst his actual body is back in a kind of version of Switzerland, just sort of, well, Venice, I think, maybe. Switzerland, just sort of walking around blankly as he's off traveling the world. There's also these two sort of women who are control it. So there's this overarching force called the Concern that sort of runs the world as it is and decides who lives and dies. There's a really awful woman called Mrs. Mulverhill, who I think is the nice one. I always get them confused. And no, Mrs. Mulderhill's the bad one, and Madam O. There's two, and I can't tell if they're actually the same person or not. There's something really complicated about them, but I don't think they are. But anyway, one of them is sort of broken away from the concern, and she's trying to like change everything up. And then there's this wheeler dealer, Adrian, and who else do we got? And an assassin as well that we follow. And it's just how these multi-story arcs kind of weave and cross each other, and this overall picture gets revealed. It's just amazing. And I find that I'm really, really drawn to kind of multi-character story arcs. And I realize that's what I'm now trying to do with Shelter. And it's so complicated to write. You're just like, who's where, and and how is it naff to just have them walk across the street and you just cut to that person, or like getting them to weave is amazing. And it does it so well, and yet it's also this hugely kind of high concept sci-fi at the same time, which I think is just so brave to do that. But I realized that like one of my other choices was going to be Margaret Atwood and the Mad Adam trilogy. I don't know if you've read that, but that also does a similar thing of these like multi-story arcs with a high concept sci-fi. And then the other one I love is The Bone Clocks by David Mitchell, which again does the same thing. It's got these sort of multi-story arcs, and it's just such an impressive feat, but only when it works. And when it does work and you can see a world or worlds in the case of transition from like multiple angles, is really fascinating, especially as this, particularly with transition. So it all kind of builds up. Basically, Temujin has been sent to kill these people by the bad one, which I think is Mrs. Mulderhill, but might get that wrong. But the breakaway woman who was his teacher and who he kind of had a fling with has convinced him not to kill these people, but instead to save them. And he's not really sure why he's doing it or if he's doing it the right thing. And it sort of takes you through how they met and how he ended up basically going rogue. So it's a bit like a bit of a spy thing as well in there. And then it has these other characters that you hear from, and you can't really figure out where they're going to come into it. And then they start appearing, and you hear their background and how they ended up being who they are. And like one of the characters is just this like Hollywood producer who's just pops up every now and again because he's got this pitch for this really great film. And you just think, why are we back with this Hollywood guy who's like, hey, I've got my elevator pitch and I'm just going to get in this meeting and this is going to be it. I'm going to get this meeting. And then it all sort of starts wrapping up and you start realizing, oh, that's why the Hollywood guy's there. And oh, that's who that person is. And oh, God, that's who he's going to be. And it's fascinating. And I can only imagine that when Banks wrote it, he must have had like, those kind of cop programs where they've got all the red string to figure out. Yeah, because you just go, how did you keep up? Because the resolutions are so clever in some ways and so satisfying that you're just like, did you know that when you started that? And then you brought in all this kind of like complexity to find it interesting. I think it's just an amazing feat. And I really recommend the audiobook because Peter Kenny is such a brilliant reader and his accents are great, which I think audiobooks live and die on whether the actor can do good accents and pronounce things properly. And he does. His London accent's as good as his Americanish and his Scottish and whatever. So yeah, I really, really recommend it. But it's a bonkers book, but hopefully enjoyable. Did you read it or did you have a flick through?
No. I kind of had a flick through. Yeah. It did sound right on my street actually. So maybe I will go with the audiobook because sometimes as I'm getting on, I find it hard to keep track of who different characters are. So maybe the accents will help and put me
I think it really helps because it's clear when you listen to the audiobooks that actually some of the characters are the same person in different dimensions, and you need to understand that for it to make sense. And I think it really, some books really benefit from being an audiobook, and this is definitely one of them.
How are you handling the multi-character strands yourself in your new work then? Do you have a spreadsheet?
No, I sort of have I downloaded Scrivener, which I don't know if you've ever used,
No.
but it's like a writing app. So not like Final Draft, but I find it much more user friendly. So Final Draft is more like script based, whereas this, what it allows you to do is have like multiple screens, like pages up. So I tend to have like a bit of a kind of plot arc on one side and then my script page on the other. So I know roughly where I'm going to. But it is really complicated, and it's been such a challenge. And I think the story gets bigger because you're trying to see when people cross and not make it too too prosaic or too obvious, or I mean, at least for me in my new one, everyone's in a sort of part of West London, so it's quite feasible for them to be in the pub at the same time or to walk past each other on the street or be on a bus or whatever. So it's not like transition where it's like multiple dimensions and it's literally across space and time they're having to. This is just West London in 1 year. So it's very, very likely, and I think because I'm basing it on the part of London I grew up and I know it well, I know when people were out and about and when people would have crossed paths, so it can feel more natural. But it is tricky. It is tricky, and I think ultimately not everyone does. But it's like whose stories mean something. It was really hard to like plot it out at the beginning, and I think once I got the kind of bones of the story plotted out, it was much easier. I worked a bit with I got an Arts Council grant on it for Shelter, and I worked a bit with Shelley Bond, and she was amazing at helping because she's obviously dealt with like Sandman and like really kind of multi-story arcs, and she gave me some really great ways of kind of like figuring out where people are and where the beats are, because I think when things get complicated, they have a tendency to get a bit dull as well. And I was really, I read my plot and I was just like, oh my God, it's really boring. Like, why is it so boring? And it's because you get caught up in the complications that actually it becomes really long-winded, and you've got to start like really kind of nailing what should happen and why and whether it matters. It's a lot of kill your darling stuff you've got to do. So, I was listening to a podcast with Richard Osmond called It's Just Entertainment or something. It's with him and Marina Hind. It's a really good podcast. And he said something like, you've got to come into something as late as possible and leave as early as possible, so it's all about like getting straight into the action of it and not worrying about, how did that person get there? Did they walk? Did they get a bus? It doesn't matter. Just get to the place. Just what are they doing? What's going on? And trying to keep that in mind, like, and not worry too much about the hows and the whys. Just get into the meat of the drama, as it were. But yeah, it's really hard. I curse myself for being drawn to this kind of narrative, to be honest. And I'll never do the levels of transition, but I'm trying.
Okay, let's talk about the comic now. Are
Yeah.
you a big comic reader? Do you read lots of
Yeah.
comics? Or
Yeah, I do. Well, again, with the pub, I had access to comics quite young, so a lot of Viz and stuff. I was really into like Garfield and Garbage Pail Kids and things like that. So I've always read comics. Read 2000 AD and stuff as a teenager, and started buying some manga. Some like Domu, Katsuhiro Otomo, and things like that. So yeah, always read comics, but didn't read a lot of European comics until I started researching barking and talking to Nick Abadzis, actually, who was really great at introducing me to some artists that I'd never heard of. So he introduced me to like Baduen and to Lorenzo Martotti, who I've chosen. So I chose Stigmata, which I have here, which is just this most extraordinary book.
it's a lovely book. It's
It's
from
a beautiful book.
Fantagraphics, isn't it?
Yeah, it's Fantagraphic, and it's got a coloured cover, which is a bit of a misnomer because it's actually this like incredible black and white piece, and I just never seen anyone draw like this. I mean, the mark making is just utterly sublime in it. He's just got this fluidity of line, and I'm sort of slightly obsessed with trying to find the perfect line to sort of describe something without too much detail, and like how do you break something down into just this kind of nice fluid line that explains the clothing or the movement or something. And he just does it. There's so much dynamism to his work, and then this beautiful kind of texture and hatching. It just blew my mind. And the book is about this kind of quite rough bouncer who kind of wakes up one day and has stigmata, and he just sort of doesn't know what the hell to do about it. And it's him sort of going around, and the people he comes across trying to explain, what does this mean? Does it mean he's like the second coming or something? And it's in Italy, so it's dealing with Catholicism and all the kind of ideas around social and who's worthy of being chosen by God, and which I found really fascinating. Like, my dad was brought up Roman Catholic, my dad was Irish background, and he hated the church because of it, to the extent that he ran a drinking session with strippers that I grew up with called the church, and the strippers used to come on dressed as nuns and things like that. So it was a really kind of like full-on thing for him, and it's clear that with Martotti in this, he's going through a very similar kind of like crisis of faith and trying to understand his religion and his God and the meaning of it all. And it sort of gets so into his own, it goes from the kind of narrative, which is beautiful and really upsetting at times and really extraordinary, and then it goes into this wild kind of abstract sort of conversation between the character and God. And by the end, it's so abstract, it's really quite hard to know what's going on, and you feel like, I think Martotti just went in on himself and just started exploring his own kind of feelings towards his upbringing and his religion. And I've just never seen anything like it. And it really made me rethink what I was doing. And I think this is when I was making Barking. And I think I was looking at, I also love Jippy, who I was also going to choose, but I choose his work so often that I thought I should choose someone else. I read Garage Band and Notes on a War Story, and recently I've got My So-Called Life, which is just a hilarious book about him being a useless teenager. But again, he's got that same kind of beautiful ink line, and the quality of their drawing and their characterization is it's so pleasing to me. I find that kind of looseness of line just endlessly fascinating, and I can just stare at it for hours. So, Stigmata is not a light read, but it is a beautiful book, and it's a really extraordinary storytelling that I think you can see why it's come out in English language with like Fantagraphics, or it would suit kind of Drawn and Quarterly, or even yourselves. So like it would take a publisher with some vision to look at it and go, oh yeah, people can read this. But to imagine like a UK readership picking up something like that, it's kind of like, what the hell is this? It's a really mad book, but I really appreciate that they bothered to translate it, because it is a really unusual story, but it's amazing. So highly recommended.
And was he an influence on your art style as well? Like I definitely saw towards the end of Barking, like some of the character faces and stuff like that
Yeah, probably.
very
I think
reminiscent.
it's really hard. I think you draw the way you draw. I do feel like it's sort of like an innate thing how you draw, and people draw themselves in many ways. But I definitely look at Martotti and Jippy and how they draw, but a lot of fine artists as well. And I love Dave McKean's ink work as well. I'm not as big on his kind of collage stuff, but his ink work is utterly divine. So yeah, I think maybe it is, yeah, because it's that. I think with Martotti though, he has that kind of thicker features. They're always quite broad nosed and stuff. Whereas I think I probably get more. I'm looking for something more like Jippy's, and sort of maybe somewhere in between the sort of slightly pointier faced characters. But I think you've got to enjoy drawing comics because they're so laborious that you've got to find that way that you find your characters pleasing to draw over and over again. So yeah, probably it would have been influential, but without being aware of it, I'd have
Hmm.
thought. Yeah, for sure.
And in terms of Barking being in black and white, did you ever consider any color for Barking, or was it always in your
No,
mind just that
no,
kind of inky?
always. Yeah, because I think just the nature of it being about depression, it had to be about the black. And once I started, because I was an animator beforehand, and you were stuck with the rectangle and having to make that interesting, I quite liked playing with the negative space and what you could get from what you didn't see. There's animator, what's his name, and he did the Red Turtle, do Dr. Vitt. I don't know, Michael do Dr. Vitt, who did yeah, the Red Turtle was Studio Ghibli, but he did this amazing film called The Monk and the Fish, which is just like a simple line hand drawn animation, and it's just this beautiful kind of line work with a little monk and a fish, and it's really really simple, and it's so beautifully animated. And again, it's just that I'm always looking for that line and how you can use the kind of space around it to draw people into where the action is and find that kind of negative space and stuff. So yeah, I think it all gets kind of melded in together, really.
Cool. And finally, let's talk about the TV show, which is, yeah, a big favorite of mine as
Oh,
well.
really? Oh,
Yeah, unless
fantastic.
you're talking about the film.
No, no, I'm talking about the TV show. Yeah, absolutely. So I chose The Singing Detective, just from the 80s. What did I had to look it up. 1986 it was from, but I definitely saw it later. I saw it. I think I
I,
probably remember my parents watching it.
I think there was a Dennis Potter season probably in the early 90s. Maybe we
Yeah,
both watched it then. Yeah.
yeah, maybe. But just again, I think there's a definite link with these where they're all things that take your expectations of what a format is and just throw it out the window, And I think with the Singing Detective, to have something that goes through so many genres. So Michael Gambon is um, Philip Marlowe, the author, sort of down at heel, that has got this horrific case of, they never fully say, but it's like a psoriasis almost, isn't it? It's like a stress related
Yeah.
psoriasis. So his skin is like flaking and red raw, and he's just agonized. And he's taken onto a men's ward in a hospital. And as he's sort of in pain and he's dealing with just being on the ward, he's kind of hallucinating through the pain. And so the staff on the ward would just sort of break into song. He hallucinates himself as the singing detective, which is from one of his stories, and it cuts between the two and his memories from childhood of his parents and the things they got up to, and it's just, I just love it, and I love the look of it. I based all the nurses embarking on the nurses in Singing Detective because they have these amazing kind of puffy sleeves and little hats that I don't think a nurse has ever worn in reality.
They're not the most practical.
No, and I mean they definitely had those kind of little pin things, but the little hat things. I mean, I did find some reference photos where they were wearing that, but it's sort of like 50s, I think, and he although it's set in the 80s, it does slide between the two, and I guess it's probably how we are with the 90s. It's sort of like what your eras are and what you hark back to kind of mentally. And
Yeah, no, a
yeah,
lot of the music comes from the 50s as well,
yeah,
or the
very,
40s as
but
well.
even earlier because
Yeah, yeah, it's
sort
all
of
very
goes into sort
traditional.
of
So,
20, not 20, it's sort of, it's wartime, isn't it? So,
mm.
but then in his, is its First World War really when he goes into singing detective land, and that's more First World War, isn't it? Or was it
I
second
think
as
it's the
well?
40s, isn't it? That's all the
40s, yeah,
film
yeah,
noir
because they've
stuff.
got
So
the,
yeah,
yeah, yeah, that's right. Yeah, it is all sort of noir detective, isn't it?
yeah,
But they have the same actors playing different roles. So like his mum who's Alison Steadman, is also like a damsel in distress in the sort of noir period. And she's not also in the 80s. Well, no, he's married. He's got an ex-wife who's got a lot of similarities to his mum, and yeah, it's just extraordinary. And it was again a massive influence on Barking because of how it deals with kind of hallucinations and hospital settings and being in quite small settings actually, because a lot of it is just on the ward, um, and difficult lead characters because he's an utter bastard. Philip Marlowe. He's horrible to people. He's awful to the nurses, particularly the one that he has a total crush on, who has to keep like emoliating his body, and every time she touches him in certain areas, he's not very good at controlling himself, and he's really rude to her because he's embarrassed and stuff, and he watches a couple of people die and quite, and they're horrible, so you don't mind one of them dying and one of them's not, and yeah, it's a really fascinating play with unreliable narrator, but also with a really complicated lead character that even though he's awful, you just kind of love him as well. And I think probably because it's Michael Gambon and he's just insanely charming, and they had to have that, right? Because otherwise you'd switch off. Yeah, because it is such a grotesque character, but he's so clever and witty and charming, and even though he's been awful to people, you're still kind of on his side. And I think that's an amazing feat, actually. And I wanted to sort of get across in Barking that not everyone who needs help is easy to help. You can, when I had my breakdown, I was really prickly, I was really aggressive, I wasn't easy to help. And how do you get people to feel sympathy for a character, because you need them to do that in order to get into the story, and also make sure that you're showing that they are quite difficult. And that's where this was such a huge influence for me, because it's like, if anyone's nailed it, I think it's the Singing Detective that has. So yeah, I think it's on iPlayer, which I was thrilled to see. I had
Oh, really?
search for it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I hadn't seen it for a while, and the whole series is on iPlayer. So if you're in the UK or you've got a VPN, you can watch that at any time for free. So I really do recommend it, because there was a sort of that sweet period with kind of, especially that 80s period, where they did some really extraordinary TV. I remember seeing, the other one I would have chosen was like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which I watched from a young age. And even though the sort of special effects are a bit shonky now, it's still amazing and wild. And it was even a TV show. It's just like, what? It's such a crazy concept. And yeah, it's got such humanity that it works so brilliantly. But I thought that would be slightly harder to explain to people, but all they've heard of it, whereas so many people haven't heard of the Singing Detective. And I think it's such an extraordinary kind of groundbreaking TV. It's one of those things that when we can be this, because it's sort of a play, it's sort of musical, but it's also very, very much a TV show. And I think it must influence so many other sort of TV creators and directors and stuff, just for how extraordinary it was.
Yeah, absolutely. I was trying to think of something that linked all these choices together when you kind of step away from it, and I think the main thing I could think of was not body horror, but there's certainly like a I don't know, like a
It's
fascination
a grotesque.
with the grotesque,
Yeah,
the body betraying the person, I guess, a little bit.
yeah, and a lot of kind of hallucination stuff.
Yeah, a lot
I
of
think,
heightened reality, and yeah.
yeah, yeah, there is, and they're all big, sort of big ideas in storytelling as well. I think, and like I said, just playing with the genre, just like you think you're watching one thing, but you're not. Like American Werewolf in London, it's funny as hell as well,
Hmm.
and also really, really touching and really sweet and sad, and it's a love story, like which is it's all those things, and I think that's what I love about a lot of these. I think all of them are more than the sum of their parts. There's so much going on in them that you can't just say, oh, it's just a TV show. It's like it's a TV show, it's a musical, it's a play, it's all these things. And the same with like Stigmata. It's a comic, but it's also a memoir. It's so many things. So I think, yeah, maybe there's something like that. But yeah, interesting, the body horror stuff and bodies betraying. That's very interesting. I think that might be a theme in my work. I had a reviewer pick up on that with my last shelter. I'm unaware that I was doing that, but I think you're right. I think there is something in that.
Excellent. Well, Lucy, thank you very much for giving up your evening to talk to me.
My pleasure.
Yeah, and goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.